light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I guess because of being a deep thinker throughout my life, I managed to gravitate more toward those types of conversations. In noticing all the details, perhaps because of my autism, whenever I've heard someone say that it's always this or it's always that, or you can be sure that, my mind immediately begins running to the exceptions, to the details of unless or except or all the things. I was told by somebody many years ago, and it really has seemed true, that there's an exception for every rule. And yet the world tries to govern itself by rules, and frequently without allowing adequate room for the exceptions or for allowing an alternative humane response to the exceptions. To say that in a classroom, students are always this or always that, or students always hate to do their homework. Well, that wasn't true for me, but I didn't really have that much homework to do in a lot of classes, but part of that was because of how much I got done while I was in school. By the time I got home, it was already done. There wasn't anything to do. And I suppose someone else could joke, well, maybe they weren't giving you enough homework. Well, I was doing very well in all my classes anyway, so it wasn't like if they had given me more homework, I would have just been that much further ahead, and that would have created other problems. There were so many different instances, though, in which, in its continual pursuit of certainty, humanity seems to keep reaching for the always, the rule that will satisfy all concerns, that will be the one rule we can follow, we can all follow, we can always follow. And in over 50 years of life, I have not been able to find any such thing. I guess the only time I would use the word always is to say that the best answer is always sometimes. Because the minute you try to say that it's always this or it's never that, my busy little mind immediately starts thinking of the exception. Unless or except. Well, that would never happen, and then it happens. And we're left standing there going, what do I do now? Instead of understanding just what a fluctuating, diverse thing this miracle of life is. I suppose you could say, neurotypical approach to philosophy and theology is to come up with some kind of principle that would apply to everything. I quote a lot of sayings, I quote a lot of things I've read, I quote a lot of principles, but even as I do so, and even as I have found certain ones to be reliable and prevalent and generally applicable, I don't know if I could go out on a limb and say that they would always work, that they would always be true, because so much of it depends upon the circumstances. But as I was hearing first ideologies from people in the Catholic Church, then from people in a Protestant church, then from people in a Pentecostal church, then from people in a Buddhist group, and a Hindu group, and a neo-pagan group, and again and again and again, they would want to say, well, for example, God always answers prayer. And then at some point I started running into ministers who would say, and sometimes God says no. Kind of a lame cop-out, in my opinion, because that's not what I asked for, but the only reason that I've ever asked for things in prayer is because they were things I genuinely needed. And being told no by someone who supposedly loves me doesn't make any sense. You love me, but you're willing to ignore the fact that I'm living in need and struggling and in pain, whatever the particular situation seems to be. And so what I began to find more and more as almost a theological principle, you could say, is the word sometimes. God answers prayer sometimes. God will help you through this horrible circumstance. Well, sometimes. God will never give you more than you can bear. Well, sometimes. And in every case, we're asked to consider, why would God give you more than you can bear? Why would things not always turn out right? Why is this happening to me? It's a legitimate question, but it's not an appropriate place to get stuck. But in every theological and philosophical argument I've ever heard, the point I keep coming back to is sometimes. When someone said, if you follow the principles of Feng Shui and put a mirror by your front door, it will reflect away everything bad. Well, sometimes. And sometimes bad things still found their way into my house. The wonderful thing about sometimes is that it can go both directions. That when someone stands up and says things are definitely things will always get worse, or things are going to get worse, and I respond sometimes. And then someone says, well, things are going to get better. Well, sometimes. I just don't know which time is which, because we ourselves are creatures of time, within the time, not able to look at the time from a distance and from an outside perspective that allows us to see why it happened this time and not that time. I'm reminded of a quote attributed to Catherine Kuhlman, a somewhat controversial faith healer, who said, I don't know why God doesn't heal everyone, but I'm very afraid of those who say they do. Those are, I would suggest, are people who are very fond of the word always. God always heals. God always answers prayer. God always keeps his promises. All sorts of things that ultimately have nothing to do with God. They're statements of human theology. They're not statements that God actually made. They weren't carved into a wall by an invisible hand or what have you. They're theological statements that people have made, trying to make the indescribable describable, trying to make God predictable when God is not. The challenge, problem, opportunity for humanity, I suppose, is to develop a sense of contentment and peace around the word sometimes. That as important as it is for us to show up and do our best, it is equally important to understand that the world is a shared space, and that sometimes things go a different direction because of someone else who, I hesitate to say it this way, but may have needed the blessing more. That suggests competition again, and I'm not trying to make things competitive, but sometimes it is helpful to remember that the world is a shared space, and consequently we all take turns being the one in need, and at some deeper level we simply all take turns. That where it may be that person's turn to win the lottery this week, it may be somebody else's turn next week. Will it ever be my turn within this lifetime? I don't know. I guess we'll figure it out when it happens. Until then, I have to do the best with whatever's within reach, and accept that sometimes I will win and sometimes I will lose. But even when I lose, sometimes there will be a better option or a way out of it that I could not have foreseen before being in that position. The the thing to remember about sometimes is that it does go both ways. It's not only negative. It's not that things will get worse. Well, sometimes. Well, things will get better. Well, sometimes. It creates the opportunity for us to create something that is not part of the current experience. It's not part of what we can or should expect. It's the maybe that gives us a chance. But it's very much up to ourselves to see what we do with that chance. And sometimes I think I know the right thing to do, and sometimes I'm absolutely sure that I don't know any right thing to do. That things have gotten so chaotic and overwhelming that I just have to give thanks that sometimes good things still happen without my help. That sometimes when I've done everything I can, I have to wait for the part that I can't do that will make all the difference I need. The additional challenge, I guess, when it comes to people, that very much ties into the dynamic of forgiveness, is that as much as somebody has hurt me or lied to me or done something to betray my trust, sometimes they act in ways that are in the opposite direction. Sometimes the one who betrayed me will do something that makes me a winner, that allows me to come out on top, that allows me to resolve a problem that I otherwise couldn't have. And that if it hadn't been for that supposed enemy on this one occasion listening and heeding my words, that all would have been lost, except that sometimes my enemy defies the expectations put on him as well. That where a community expected someone to be bad and expected someone to be untrustworthy, that community finds that sometimes the person does the right thing, and sometimes love prevails, and sometimes wisdom is what the wisdom is what makes itself available within the moment in which it's needed. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And if you're busy looking at the gutter because of what didn't happen, you will miss the wonderful thing dropped right in front of you when it does happen. Because sometimes it does. Thinking in terms of the specific application of sometimes you think you know someone, sometimes it turns into betrayal, but in other times it can also be turned into discovery. At this point in time, I have recorded over 410 shows of Sister Who Presents or other sorts of shows featuring Sister Who. Over the course of all those many, many, many episodes, way at the beginning, I interviewed a man that I found to be very creative, very unusual, and yet deeply insightful. And he shared how he had grown up within the Jehovah's Witness religious tradition, and how the religious conservatism just was not able to encompass all the creative and spiritual realities he found within himself. And in that episode so many years ago, he shared a quotation of a well-known poem called Desiderata, which is essentially this recommendation for a spiritual way of living that doesn't directly advocate or disallow anyone's notions of the divine. But he had such a mellow, wonderful voice and recited it so eloquently and so smoothly, it was positively beautiful. And then a few years later, I discovered that his own journey of self-discovery led him to the realization that he was actually a trans woman. And so he began his transition. And we had a discussion on the show again of the sorts of things he was learning and how he came to wrestle with these deep questions and the process of going through I guess what you might call a trans journey within the United States in comparison to other places around the world, where it may be easier and quicker, but there is a sort of protection in the more complicated process, in that there were this long list of psychological and emotional issues with which now she had to come to terms as part of this journey to prepare her for being or becoming the trans woman that she was apparently always meant to be. And then later on we had another conversation as she was coming to the completion of her transition and finding herself, looking in the mirror and finding herself to be the woman that she always understood herself to be. Or not always, I say always understood herself to be, as if it was there throughout life, and I guess it was on some level, but for the first probably 40-some years of his life, he didn't realize that he was a trans woman. He was seeking some kind of vocabulary, some kind of awareness that would make sense of all these disparate qualities, and ultimately did find it, but it kind of brings us back to the word sometimes, is that ideally people would be able to figure out in childhood and their teenage years whether they are gay, straight, trans, lesbian, intersexual, whatever, so that then they could spend their entire adult lives building on that understanding. Sometimes it turns out very beautifully and peacefully, and sometimes it turns out to be one hell of a struggle and quite painful on emotional and psychological levels. That the uncertainty that you find within the word sometimes, though, was something with which Lily had to wrestle continuously as she was going through her transition. That sometimes she felt this and sometimes she felt that, and sometimes she felt overwhelmed and sometimes she felt in control. The encouragement, I hope, of the word sometimes is that sometimes, even in the worst moments, some sort of breakthrough is still available, some sort of overlooked piece, something that makes all the difference, and you finally find it, and then you discover it was there all along. Well, why didn't I see that before? In some ways it's analogous to me finally being diagnosed with autism. In retrospect, I can look back all the way into early childhood and reflect upon memories and times that would have made it abundantly clear that, of course, I'm a high-functioning autistic. The problem was that at that point in time, the world didn't have that kind of terminology or understanding. No one had an understanding that high-functioning autistics existed, much less that it would have anything to do with me. And sometimes I felt quite overwhelmed, and sometimes I had meltdowns, but we didn't know to call them meltdowns. And sometimes, in spite of all the discouragements and all the struggle and all the intensity, I still made it through. And I still managed to accomplish all sorts of things that nobody would have believed were possible. In trying to understand Lily and her perspective and her wrestling with the sometimesness of feelings, and when we say sometimes, that can also refer to some time within one's life. That there was a time where he thought it was this way, and then she discovered that it was this way, and it was quite different. But then the challenge became embracing the word sometimes and making the most of it, so that what showed up occasionally as a sometimes sort of phenomena could become very important clues to the bigger picture that she ultimately put together of who and what she was. and reaching a point where she was very happy with herself and very happy with her life. But the problem was that sometimes, even when you're happy, even when you're in your bliss, sometimes the world doesn't reward that. And she ultimately ran out of money, had no way and no place to be, and wound up tragically committing suicide. And it was all the more amazing for that reason, I guess, that I was first was it a privilege? I consider it an honor, because this was someone about whom I cared very much, someone I esteemed very highly, someone I found to be brilliant and creative and wonderful. And so I considered it a privilege that the maintenance man and I got to be the ones to find the body. I would rather that we had found her alive. But by being the one to find the body, I was the one who got to talk to the police, and I had the honor, and it was an honor, of facilitating her memorial service and of playing a recording at the memorial service of her singing a song I'd written for. In the song, I tried to wrestle with or dance between the different vague, sometimes, points within her life. That sometimes it's cloudy and sometimes it's clear, and sometimes we see and sometimes we don't. But in each case, we still have to find ways to keep going. I guess the summary of the word sometimes is just to remember that it's some times. It's a collection of times from yet another perspective. It's a collection of times that make up a person's life, and sometimes are this way, and some of the times are that way, and some of the times we don't know how to categorize. In trying to understand and relate to her and figure out what can one really say from a spiritual perspective about identity. The first verse starts out, "For so very long I remember, my reflection wasn't me, but a different form and a different norm, something I was supposed to be. I remember touching others with hands that weren't my own. I remember being something that's no longer so unknown. Now my soul knows its face, and my heart finally knows its place. There's still a chance that my feet will dance, and my voice will sing out my true name. The music of my heart and hands, a holy mystery forever stands. For love unknown within has grown to become the gift of me. I remember being hungry for love without demands. I remember being lonely in a world of shifting sands. I remember to the moment when the sun began to rise. I remember the revelation and tears of joy within my eyes. Now my soul knows its face, and my heart finally knows its place. There's still a chance that my feet will dance, and my voice will sing out my true name. The music of my heart and hands, a holy mystery forever stands. For love unknown within has grown to become the gift of me." Do you share with me the memory of life that wants to start? Would you share the great discovery of courage of the heart? Would you make the great commitment to be who you really are? Can we finally stand together and fill the night with stars? My soul knows its face, and my heart finally knows its place. There's still a chance that my feet will dance, and my voice will sing out my true name. The music of my heart and hand, a holy mystery forever stands. For love unknown within has grown to become the gift of me. And sometimes we know exactly who we are, and sometimes we search through the mist trying to find the remaining pieces. Thank you very much for watching, and blessings be upon you in all your continuing searching for the fullest and most wonderful part of yourself that sometimes the world will let you be. Thank you.